5 o'clock in the morning, before the lamps of the North End market had even come on, Meredith Calloway was already standing behind her folding table, laying out warm lavender honey cookies row by row. She sprinkled sea salt across the tops, 3 quick, decisive taps of the wrist, a habit she had kept for years without ever once asking herself where she had learned it. An older woman walking past stopped mid-step. She stood there watching the young woman's hands, and found she couldn't move. She asked for 2, bit into one right there on the sidewalk, and the cookie slipped out of her fingers, lavender and honey. 15 years ago, every Sunday morning, she had stood in a kitchen up on Beacon Hill, making these exact cookies, beside a 12-year-old girl perched on a step stool, learning to salt them the way she did 3 taps. That summer, the girl disappeared. The whole city of Boston came to believe she was gone for good. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Meredith bent down, picked up the fallen cookie, and handed her a fresh one. "Here, this one's on me." The woman looked at the sleeve the girl had just pushed back from her wrist, and asked in a voice that had already broken, "What's your name?" "Meredith Calloway." She said nothing more. She turned and walked quickly to the car waiting across the street, and only when the door shut did her assistant hear her say, "Look into that girl," quietly, because over the past 15 years, 6 different women had come forward claiming to be the missing Whitmore daughter. 6 times she believed them. 6 times she was wrong, and she had promised herself she would never let herself hope again. There was only one problem. Those 3 taps of sea salt were something no one on earth could ever teach another person. If you've made it this far, leave a like so this story can reach a few more people. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And subscribe to walk the rest of this journey with us. The car had gone 3 blocks before Cordelia Whitmore finally spoke. She didn't look out the window, and she didn't look at the assistant sitting across from her. She simply said, "Call Arthur Penhall, his private number, not the office." The assistant, Bethany, handed her the phone, and while they waited for someone on the other end to pick up, she noticed that her employer's hand was still trembling. In 10 years of working beside this woman, she had never once seen that hand shake. Not even the night Cordelia signed the order, recalling an entire product line worth $80 million. "Arthur, I need you to do something for me." Her voice had already regained its usual calm. "There's a girl who sells pastries at the North End Market. Her name is Meredith Calloway. I need to know where she was born, who raised her, what records exist, and who she was before the age of 12. She paused for a moment. "And Arthur, this can't go through the company's legal department. Not one piece of paper, not one line of email is to pass through there. You do this privately for me. Send the bill to my home, not to Whitmore Medical." Bethany looked up, unable to hide her surprise. The previous 6 times, every investigation had been handled by the legal department, with thick files, signatures, notarized documents, and even specialists brought in to verify every detail. That same department had exposed 4 of the 6 imposters. When Cordelia ended the call, Bethany asked softly, "Ma'am, is something wrong with legal?" Cordelia set the phone down on the seat. She stayed silent long enough for Bethany to think she had asked the wrong question. Then Cordelia spoke, slowly, like someone weighing each word before letting it fall. 4 years ago, a woman in Providence sent a letter to the company. She wasn't asking for a reward. She only sent a photograph and said I might want to see it. That letter never reached my desk. I found out only because a receptionist told me about it after she quit. By the time I sent someone to look for the woman in Providence, she'd moved somewhere else. No one was ever able to find her again. Bethany didn't dare ask another question, but Cordelia kept speaking. And now her voice had grown so quiet that it was almost as if she were speaking only to herself. "There's someone on my board of directors who doesn't want my daughter to come home. I don't know who it is. I only know there is someone." She turned her face toward the window. "I learned that at a very high price, Bethany. So this time, I don't want anyone to know who I'm looking for." The car stopped in front of the Whitmore Medical Building just before 8 o'clock. Cordelia went up to the 19th floor, greeted 3 people passing her in exactly the same voice she used every morning, sat down at her desk, signed 3 documents, listened to a report about the assembly line in Worcester, and no one in that building realized that the woman sitting at the head of the table that morning hadn't heard a single word. At 11 o'clock, she told Bethany to step outside and close the door. Then she opened the bottom drawer on the left, the only drawer in the room with its own lock, and took out an envelope that had yellowed with age. Inside was only one photograph. It showed a kitchen in Beacon Hill, sunlight pouring through the window behind it, and a 12-year-old girl standing on a wooden stool, clutching a jar of sea salt tightly in both hands, as though she were afraid someone might take it away. The girl was laughing, She had just ruined an entire tray of pastries by sprinkling on far too much salt, and the person taking the photograph was her father, standing in the corner of the kitchen and laughing so hard that the picture had come out slightly blurred. In 15 years, that photograph had never been shown to a single investigator. It had never been printed in a newspaper. It had never appeared in any of the files on those 6 women, because Cordelia had understood something very early on. People could memorize a birth date. They could memorize the dog's name. They could even memorize the little alley that led to the back garden. But if she showed them this photograph, they would learn the 3 little movements of her hand, too. And then the last thing Cordelia still had left of her daughter would be taken from her as well. She set the photograph on the desk and stared at it for a long time, then slipped it back into the envelope and locked the drawer. On the way home that afternoon, she told the driver to circle past the North End Market. The folding table had been packed away long before. All that remained on the sidewalk was the last strip of evening sunlight and a scrap of pastry paper tumbling along in the wind. Cordelia sat in the car and stared at that empty place for exactly 30 seconds, then told the driver to keep going. She had promised herself that she wouldn't hope anymore. She was still trying to keep that promise. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Meredith pushed open the door of the Brookline nursing home with a box of still warm pastries tucked beneath her arm. She came here 3 times a week, always at this exact hour, because this was the part of the day when Adeline was most lucid. At the reception desk, a nurse named Marguerite looked up and spoke immediately, without bothering with any polite preamble. "Miss Calloway, accounting left a notice for you. It's $4,200 this month. They said you still owe $800 from last month." Meredith took the paper, folded it in half, and slipped it into her coat pocket as though it contained nothing worth worrying about. "I'll send it next week." Marguerite watched her walk away, then said to the trainee nurse standing beside her, her voice low enough that she apparently thought no one else could hear, "She's adopted. Adeline took her in when the girl was 12. Everything was done properly. The records are still on file with the Department of Family Services. They say the girl couldn't remember anything from before that. Adeline raised her on a public school cafeteria cook's wages. Raised her for 15 years. The trainee nurse asked. "She really couldn't remember anything?" Marguerite shrugged. "Nothing, but she never went looking. She just works and pays the nursing home bills." Room 214 was at the end of the hallway, its window facing a maple tree. Adeline was sitting in her wheelchair with her hands resting neatly in her lap, and when she saw Meredith come in, her whole face brightened. "Oh," the kind nurse. "You're here." Meredith smiled and set the pastry box on the table. "Yes, I'm here." She didn't correct her. She had stopped correcting her 8 months ago, ever since the day she'd said, "It's Meredith, Mom," and watched Adeline recoil against the back of her chair in alarm, like someone who'd been caught doing something wrong. "Will you stay and have tea with me?" "I have tea. They gave me 2 bags. She opened the drawer, rummaged through it, pulled out exactly 2 tea bags, and placed them on the table with the solemn dignity of someone presenting the most precious thing she owned. Meredith made the tea with hot water from the hallway, divided the pastries onto plates, and the 2 of them sat together for 40 minutes. Adeline told her about a schoolboy who used to hide his vegetables in his pockets. She told the story 3 times, and each time it was slightly different. Meredith listened all 3 times, and every time, she laughed in exactly the right places. Near 5 o'clock, when Meredith stood to clear away the cups, Adeline suddenly fell silent. She stared at her for a long moment, and her gaze abruptly sharpened, as though someone had just pulled a curtain aside. Then she turned toward the bedside cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a cloth-bound notebook with all 4 corners worn bare, and pressed it into Meredith's hands. "It's yours. Mom was only keeping it safe for you." Meredith froze. Adeline had given her this notebook no fewer than 100 times over the years, forgetting each time that she'd already handed it over before. But this was the first time in 8 months that she'd called Meredith her child. Meredith opened the notebook, even though she knew every page by heart. The first page was covered in a child's handwriting, clumsy and uneven, some letters huge, some small, some written over one another, because there had been no room left on the line. "Lavender honey cookies. Let the butter soften. Don't put it in the microwave. Use dark honey. 3 pinches of lavender, no more." And on the final line, written in blue-colored pencil and traced over again and again until the paper had nearly torn, "Sprinkle sea salt in 3 beets, not 4. 4 makes it too salty." Meredith read that line, and as always, something tightened painfully inside her chest, a feeling like standing before a locked door, while somehow knowing she had once possessed the key. She turned a few more pages. The handwriting changed later on, becoming neater, older, the writing of Meredith herself at 15 and 16, adding recipes Adeline had taught her. But the first 3 pages weren't hers. The first 3 pages belonged to a 12-year-old child Meredith could no longer remember ever having been. "Mom." She sat down in front of the wheelchair and took Adeline's hand. "Who taught me to write this?" Adeline looked at her and smiled gently, and the curtain had already fallen again. "What did you ask me, dear? Would you like some more tea? I still have another bag." Meredith nodded and said yes, then slipped the notebook into her purse. She had held it hundreds of times in her life, and just as she had hundreds of times before, she didn't ask another question, because somewhere deep inside her, for a very long time, there had been a fear she had never dared to put into words. If she went searching, what if the only thing she found was the truth that for the past 15 years, there hadn't been a single person in this world searching for her? 2 years earlier, Meredith Calloway was still a science teacher at Wexford Prep, and that cloth-bound notebook still rested in the drawer of her desk, beside a stack of student workbooks. Back then, she stayed at school until 10 o'clock at night almost every day, because she was working on something she believed mattered. She called it Lightbox. The idea was so simple that many of her colleagues laughed at it. Instead of forcing students to learn the theory first, and only then perform the experiment, she reversed the order. She let the children put their hands on the equipment first, make mistakes first, ask questions first, and only afterward go searching for the answers. She spent 14 months developing it, paid for the components out of her own pocket, and wrote every page of the curriculum herself. What made Lightbox different from every other program was the scientific foundation section at the end, where she demonstrated that this method helped students detect equipment failures more quickly, and to prove it, she needed a real example. She went into the public database of the Food and Drug Administration, searched through, recalled medical devices, and selected the case with the most complete set of data. It involved a batch of heart valves manufactured in 2009. She cited 3 data tables, clearly identified the source, and moved on to the next page. To her, it was nothing more than a number. She knew nothing about it, didn't know anyone connected to it, and throughout the entire 14 months she spent working, she never thought about it again. In early March, she submitted a research grant application to the Massachusetts State Education Foundation, along with the complete curriculum. The first person she showed the draft to was Preston Hale, the physics teacher in her department, the man she'd been dating for more than 2 years. He read it, nodded approvingly, told her she was brilliant, then asked if he could borrow the data drive so he could print everything out and read it more carefully at home. She handed it to him without a second thought. 3 weeks later, the Education Foundation notified her that they had received 2 identical submissions. One carried the name Meredith Calloway, the other carried the name Preston Hale, and Preston's version included a formal complaint, along with a printed copy of the curriculum presented as his original work, bearing a timestamp exactly 4 months earlier than hers. Meredith read the notice in the laboratory with chalk dust still clinging to her hands. She called Preston. He didn't answer. She went looking for him in the faculty room, in the cafeteria, in the parking lot, and finally found him in the 2nd floor hallway, standing there talking to someone on the phone. He saw her, ended the call, and the first thing he said wasn't an explanation, and it wasn't a denial. He said, "Don't make this into something bigger than it is. No one is going to believe you." She asked him why. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, then walked away. Meredith filed a formal complaint with the school board and submitted 32 dated drafts, photographs of the whiteboard in her laboratory, messages she'd sent to herself at midnight, and even receipts for components purchased in her own name. The board scheduled a meeting with her for Thursday. But by Wednesday, the decision had already been made. Warren Ashcroft, superintendent of the Boston School District, signed it within a single day, without convening a hearing, and without calling Meredith in to ask even one question. The ruling stated that Meredith Calloway had appropriated a colleague's work and fabricated documents to support her claim. Attached to it was a recommendation that her case be referred to the State Teacher Certification Board. 6 weeks later, her teaching license was revoked. She was barred from teaching at any educational institution anywhere in Massachusetts for an indefinite period. The day she cleared her belongings out of the laboratory, only one colleague came to see her off, Josie Marlowe, and Josie cried more than Meredith did. Meredith didn't cry. She only asked the security guard at the gate whether she was allowed to keep the boxes of components she'd bought with her own money, and the guard said yes, she could take them home. She carried them back to her rented apartment, slid them beneath the bed, and 3 days later began baking pastries to sell. As for Preston Hale, 2 weeks after the ruling was signed, he was appointed vice principal of Wexford Prep. On the day of his appointment, He was invited into a small conference room at the school district building. Warren Ashcroft pushed a thick envelope across the table and said only one sentence. "You did well. This ends here." Preston took the envelope, thanked him, and didn't ask a single question. He didn't ask why a district superintendent would personally involve himself in a curriculum dispute between two high school teachers. He didn't ask why the decision had been signed so quickly. He didn't ask why anyone would pay him that much money simply to put his name on a collection of lesson plans. He only thought he'd gotten lucky. And for the next 2 years, Preston Hale lived with the belief that what he'd stolen from his former girlfriend was an opportunity for professional advancement. He had no idea that what he'd really buried that day was 3 tables of data concerning a batch of heart valves manufactured in 2009. That same evening, about 4 miles west of the North End Market, in an old house in Winchester where 3 generations of the Vitali family had lived, Teresa Vitali told the servants to clear the table early and asked her grandson to stay behind. Cassian Vitali sat down without asking why. At 78, his grandmother was still the only person in the city who could tell him to sit without offering a reason. She said nothing throughout dinner. Only after the coffee was brought out did she place a yellowed sheet of paper on the table, folded into quarters, its edges so worn that it was nearly tearing along the creases. "Read it." Cassian unfolded it. The handwriting belonged to his grandfather, who had died 9 years earlier, written in blue ink, slanted and rigid, much like the man himself. Beneath it were 2 signatures. One belonged to his grandfather, the other belonged to a man named Hollis Whitmore. The message was only 4 lines long. From this day forward, whatever the Whitmore family needs, the Vitale family will do it. Once, without asking why, without conditions, without any time limit. The date on the paper was in July, 15 years earlier. "I already know about this." Cassian folded the paper again. Dad's heart valve failed. 4 hospitals refused to operate because there were things in his record they didn't want to be associated with. The Whitmores provided the equipment and the people. Teresa nodded. Hollis Whitmore came to the hospital himself at 2 o'clock in the morning. He didn't ask what your father did for a living. He only asked how much time your father had left. She looked at her grandson. "Your father lived another 6 years because of that valve, Cassian. You were part of those 6 years. Cassian was silent for a moment, then said, "Hollis drowned 15 years ago, that very summer. His daughter disappeared the same year. They're both gone, Grandma. This debt was buried with them." Teresa set down her coffee cup, and her voice didn't rise at all. Yet the entire room seemed to grow a degree colder. "The Vitali family doesn't bury debts," she said. "Your grandfather kept this paper in a safe for 15 years. Your father kept it for another 3 before he died. Then it came to me. In 3 generations of this family, no one has ever allowed a debt to die with the person it was owed to. And I won't allow you to be the first." Cassian didn't argue. He never argued with his grandmother, partly out of respect, partly because he knew she was right. "Then what do you want me to do? The person we owe is gone." "Then go and prove that she's gone." She pushed the paper toward him. "Cordelia Whitmore is still alive. Go see her. If she tells you her daughter is dead, ask her for a written statement confirming it, and then burn this paper in front of her. That's what it means to settle a debt. But if her daughter is still alive somewhere in this world, then our family's debt belongs to that girl, not to anyone else." Cassian picked up the paper, studied it for another moment, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Yes, that was the entire conversation. On the drive home, Bruno Ferraro, sitting in the front seat, turned around and handed him a thin report, only 3 pages long. "You told me to keep an eye on the Whitmores before you met with her. There's something." Cassian opened it and read beneath the small light inside the car. For the past 3 weeks, a private law firm in Cambridge called Penhall and Associates had been quietly investigating the background of a 27-year-old woman named Meredith Calloway, who sold pastries at the North End Market. The bill for the investigation wasn't being sent to Whitmore Medical. It was being sent directly to Cordelia Whitmore's private home address in Beacon Hill. "The 7th one," Bruno said. 15 years, 6 of them. Every one of them was after the reward money. One even memorized the name of the family's dog. Now there's a 7th, and this time she's hiding it from her own company. Cassian reread the final page, where her occupation was listed. Cookie vendor at the North End Farmers Market, every morning from 5 o'clock. He folded the report shut. Who chooses selling pastries as a way to get close to a family worth $3 billion? Bruno asked. It doesn't make sense. It does, Cassian said. If she knew Cordelia would walk past that spot. He handed the report back to Bruno. Investigate the girl. Treat it as fraud. Find out who's behind her. Who's paying her. Who taught her that pastry recipe. I need to know before I sit down across from Mrs. Whitmore. Bruno nodded. The car turned onto the main road, and Cassian Vitali, who had just been given the task of proving that the Whitmore girl was dead, had no idea that 3 days later he would be standing in front of a folding table at the North End Market, and everything he believed to be certain would begin to tremble from that moment on. 3 days later, Cassian Vitali walked into the Whitmore Medical Building at 10 o'clock in the morning without an appointment. The receptionist started to ask his name, then saw the 2 men who had come in behind him stop at the entrance and go no farther, and she decided to call the 19th floor instead of asking any more questions. 4 minutes later, Bethany came all the way down to the lobby to meet him. "In the elevator," she said. "My employer has 15 minutes. Cassian replied, "I only need 5. Cordelia Whitmore's office didn't look like the office of someone who ran a $3 billion corporation. There were no paintings, no liquor cabinet, no wall covered in awards. There was only a wooden desk, 2 chairs, and an old steel filing cabinet. She didn't stand when he entered. She simply gestured toward the chair across from her. "Cassian Vital," she said, "I knew your grandfather. I also know why you're here. Because in 15 years, there's only been one reason for a member of the Vitali family to walk through this door." Cassian placed the sheet of paper folded into quarters on the desk without opening it. She didn't pick it up either. "Your husband saved my father that July," he said. "My family has carried this debt for 15 years. My grandmother wants it repaid to the right person. But according to this paper, the debt is owed to your family, and the only heir to your family has been missing for 15 years. He paused. "I need you to sign a death certificate for Rosalind Whitmore. Once I have that paper, I'll burn this one in front of you, and the debt will be settled." Cordelia didn't answer immediately. She stood, walked to the steel filing cabinet, opened the middle drawer, and brought out a stack of 6 thick files. She placed them in front of him one by one, without hurry. "You want to know why I haven't signed?" She sat down. "These are 6 reasons." She pushed the first file toward him. This one was from Lowell. She had a birthmark in exactly the right place, exactly the right shape. A tattoo. I paid 3 doctors to tell me it was a tattoo, and for 2 weeks I still didn't believe them. The second file. This one remembered which direction the kitchen window in my house faced. Later, I learned that the house had been photographed for an interior design magazine in 2006. The third. This one knew the name of our dog, Barnaby. No newspaper had ever mentioned him. She spent 3 months and $7,000 buying that information from a man who once worked as a gardener at our house. She pushed the remaining 3 files across without saying anything more about them. 6 times, Mr. Vitali. 6 times I sat in a car on the way to meet them, and told myself that this time it was real. 6 times I went home and couldn't eat for 4 days. Cassian looked at the stack of files. "Then you already have your answer," he said. "All 6 were frauds. No one is searching anymore. The police closed the case 11 years ago. You sign one name, and you can finally stop." Cordelia looked up at him, and for the first time during the meeting, she smiled, a smile so weary it looked almost like pain. "How old are you, Cassian?" 33. "Do you have children?" "No." "Then you can't understand, and I don't blame you," she said. "You think I haven't signed because I still have hope. That's not it. I can sign. I sign hundreds of papers every week. Some of them cost 2,000 people their jobs. My hand doesn't shake." She placed both hands on the desk, the hands of a 59-year-old woman, blue veins standing clearly beneath the skin. "I don't sign because signing means admitting that my child died somewhere without me there, that she called for her mother and I didn't hear her, that she left this world without anyone holding her hand." Her voice remained steady and didn't break. "I wasn't allowed to see my daughter one last time, Mr. Vital. People can take everything else from me, but the right to refuse to believe that, I keep, and I'll keep it until the day I die." Cassian sat in silence. He was a man who had sat across from federal judges, bankers, and men carrying guns beneath their jackets, and every one of those times he had always known what to say next. This time, he didn't. He stood, picked up the paper, folded into quarters, and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'm sorry for wasting your time." Out in the hallway, he stopped in front of the elevator longer than necessary. Bruno asked whether he should call the lawyer. Cassian shook his head. "Change the direction of the investigation," he said. "I want to know who that girl selling pastries is, who she really is." At 5:45 the next morning, the black car stopped half a block from the North End Market, and Cassian Vitali walked the rest of the way. He wanted to watch the girl work before he said a single word to her. He stood across the street for 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, she sold 9 bags of pastries, gave every customer the correct change, bent down to pick up a wallet an elderly woman had dropped, and once slipped an extra pastry to a man who paid entirely in loose change without saying anything at all. She simply pushed the pastry toward him and turned away to do something else so he wouldn't have to thank her. Cassian had sat in rooms with people who could perform far better than that, but he had never seen anyone put on an act for a man paying with coins. He crossed the street. "Give me a bag." Meredith looked up and smiled. "Large or small?" "Large." She packed the pastries, sealed the bag, put a label on it, and handed it to him. $15. Cassian took out his wallet, placed 3 $100 bills flat on the folding table, then picked up the bag and walked away without waiting. He had gone only 7 steps when he heard footsteps running behind him. Sir, wait." She caught up with him at the corner, breathing a little hard, the entire stack of money in her hand. "You gave me the wrong amount, $300. It wasn't a mistake. It's too much." She said it quickly, as though she were afraid that if she hesitated for even one more second, she might not be able to say it at all. "I can't keep this. The bag is only $15. Please take it back." Cassian didn't reach for the money. He looked at her and deliberately let the silence stretch between them, the kind of silence he had used to break many people over the course of his 33 years. She didn't take back what she'd said. She simply stood there, with the money still extended toward him. And finally she placed it on top of her own pastry bin and stepped back. "If you won't take it, I'll leave it here. I really can't keep it." "Do you know how much the Whitmore family is offering to anyone who finds their daughter?" he asked. The question dropped between them without warning, with no beginning and no explanation. Cassian had asked questions like that many times in his life, in many different forms, and he knew exactly what he was looking for. A blink that came a fraction too slowly, a pause of half a second, a hand rising to tuck back a strand of hair. Meredith frowned. "Which family?" "Whitmore." "Whitmore," she repeated, and her expression was that of someone genuinely searching her memory to see whether the name belonged anywhere inside it. "Is that the company that makes breathing machines?" "I think the nursing home where my mother stays has a few machines with that name on them." Cassian didn't answer. "Why are you asking me that?" she asked. But before she could hear his reply, she glanced back toward the folding table, where 2 customers had just stopped and were looking over the remaining tray. "Can you wait a minute?" Then she ran back. Actually ran, without looking over her shoulder. Cassian remained where he was for a while longer. He watched her sell the last tray of pastries, listened as she playfully argued with an older customer about whether lavender really went well with honey, watched her wipe down the table, fold it, and tie it shut. The $300 was still sitting untouched on top of the bin, one corner of the bills lifting in the wind, and she placed the salt jar on top to keep them from blowing away, then forgot about them completely. She didn't ask another question about the Whitmore family, not one word. Back in the car, Bruno handed him a new file. "Boss, I traced 2 leads. There's a small media firm in Quincy that specializes in building fake backgrounds for fraudulent adoption claims. I sent some people to." "Stop," Cassian said. Bruno looked up. "Stop the fraud angle completely," Cassian said. "Move everyone onto finding out who she is, who adopted her, where she was raised, what exists from before she turned 12. I want the family services records." Bruno was silent for a moment, then asked, "Why?" Cassian looked out through the window toward the folding table, now standing upright against the wall. "Because every fraud knows who the Whitmores are," he said. The 6 before her memorized the dog's name. Who tries to squeeze $3 billion out of a family without even knowing the name of the family they're planning to extort? She just asked me whether Whitmore was the company that makes breathing machines. Bruno closed the file. "Or she's better at pretending than all 6 of the others." "Maybe," Cassian said. "But there's one more thing." He opened the bag of pastries on his lap, took one out, and studied it for a long time in the light coming through the car window. Across its surface, the grains of sea salt lay scattered in 3 clean, evenly spaced strokes, deliberate and precise, without a single grain too many. 15 years ago, I ate this exact pastry, he said, in a kitchen in Beacon Hill. The call came on Tuesday afternoon while Meredith was washing trays in her cramped kitchen. The woman on the other end spoke quickly and introduced herself as an event coordinator for the Chandler Hotel. She said their previous supplier had canceled with only 4 days' notice, and they needed 300 cookies for a gala on Saturday night. Meredith dried her hands, tucked the phone between her shoulder and ear, and asked about the price. The woman named a figure, then added that because of the short notice, the hotel was willing to pay 70% in advance that very day. Meredith calculated it in her head. 70% of that amount, combined with what she expected to make at the market that week, would be just enough to cover $4,200, plus the $800 she still owed from the previous month. "What kind of event is it?" she asked. The Teacher of the Year Gala. Wexford Prep is hosting it. Meredith didn't say anything for 3 seconds. The woman on the other end thought the connection had gone bad and said hello twice. I heard you, Meredith said. I'll take it. She ended the call and stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the wet tray in the sink. Then she opened a drawer, took out the nursing home bill, smoothed it flat, taped it to the refrigerator door with a small piece of tape, and began weighing butter. The following afternoon, someone from the hotel brought the contract directly to her apartment, along with a sample invitation printed on thick cardstock the kind guests would be holding in their hands on Saturday night. They gave her one copy so she would know how to design the cookie packaging to match. Meredith held the invitation and skimmed the name of the event, the name of the hotel's theater, the starting time, then let her eyes move down to the final line printed in small, pale gray letters at the lower right corner, the kind of line no guest in the world would ever stop to read. Principal sponsor, Whitmore Medical. Her eyes passed over it exactly once and moved on. She set the invitation on the table, tucked it beneath the sugar jar, and turned back to sign the contract. If someone had asked her that evening what had been printed on the invitation, she wouldn't have been able to answer. 4 miles away, at the Wexford Prep Administrative Building, the list of vendors for the gala was printed out and posted on the security department bulletin board Thursday morning, along with the access map and delivery schedule. It was standard procedure, and no one paid much attention to it. An older security guard named Walter Pruitt walked past the board at 7 o'clock in the morning, stopped out of habit, and let his eyes run down the column of names. Fresh flowers, wine, sound and lighting, pastries and desserts. Meredith Calloway. Delivery at 4:30 in the afternoon. East Service entrance. He stood there for a very long time. A coworker passed and greeted him, but Walter didn't hear. The man had to touch his shoulder and ask if he was all right before Walter turned and said he was fine, told him to go on ahead. Then Walter lifted one hand and gripped the edge of the bulletin board, and that coworker would later say his hand was trembling so badly that several of the pinned papers shifted crooked beneath it. For 4 years, Walter Pruitt had worked the night shift in the laboratory building. For 4 years, every morning he had placed a cup of coffee outside the second-floor science lab, black, no sugar, at 6:45, then walked away before the science teacher arrived. 2 years ago, that teacher stopped coming. Walter still left the first cup there. At noon, he came back and found it sitting untouched and cold, carried it downstairs, poured it out, and from the next morning onward, he stopped. At 9 o'clock that morning, Walter Pruitt knocked on the security supervisor's door. He asked to switch on to the Saturday night shift. The supervisor looked up, slightly surprised, because the Saturday shift was at the Chandler Hotel. 8 straight hours standing in the lobby in uniform without being allowed to sit, and everyone in the department tried to avoid it. You're 63, Walter, and your knee isn't good. That shift is hard on the legs. I can do it, he said. No one's fighting you for that shift. You don't have to ask. The supervisor laughed, pulled the assignment book closer, crossed out one name, and wrote Walter's in its place. If you want it, it's yours. Just remember to bring that knee spray. Walter thanked him, closed the door behind him, and walked all the way down the hall before stopping and leaning his back against the wall. He hadn't asked for that shift because he wanted to stand guard. He had asked for it because it was the first time in 2 years that he knew exactly where his daughter would be on a particular evening, and because somewhere deep inside him, he had a very bad feeling about bringing her back into a room filled with the people who had once pushed her out. At 4:30 on Saturday afternoon, Meredith pushed a cart carrying 10 boxes of cookies through the East Service entrance of the Chandler Hotel. The event coordinator led her down the kitchen corridor, showed her where the dessert table would be set up, and it wasn't until Meredith stepped out of the hallway and looked into the grand ballroom that she saw the backdrop. It stood nearly 13 feet high behind the stage, and in the center was the seal of Wexford Prep, the torch-shaped emblem she had seen every day for 7 years. Meredith stopped for exactly one breath. The coordinator turned around and asked if she was all right. Yes, Meredith said. Where would you like me to set up the table? She had already received 70% of the contract payment and had transferred it directly into the Brookline Nursing Home's account on Wednesday. She had no choice but to stay. At 7 o'clock, the guests began arriving. Meredith stayed in the service kitchen behind the velvet curtain, separating the hallway from the ballroom, arranging cookies on silver trays in batches. She could hear the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and at one point she recognized the voice of a former colleague, then another, and she lowered her head and worked faster. At 8 o'clock, the awards ceremony began. The host spoke about the 40-year tradition of the Teacher of the Year award. then introduced the winning project. And when he read the name of that project, Meredith's hand stopped in midair, still holding the pastry tongs. Lightbox, the reverse experimental science teaching method. The host read the first 3 sentences word for word. 3 sentences she had rewritten 11 times in the second-floor laboratory close to midnight. 3 sentences she could still remember down to every comma. Then he announced the author. Please welcome Mr. Preston Hale, Vice Principal of Wexford Prep. Meredith pulled the velvet curtain aside by barely 2 finger widths. Preston walked onto the stage to applause, accepted the trophy, shook hands with 3 people, and stepped up to the microphone. He waited until the applause had completely died away before he spoke. I'm standing here tonight, and I know very well that I didn't get here on my own. His voice was warm, slow, carefully rehearsed. There's a woman who sacrificed everything so I could stand in this place. Someone who stayed awake through countless nights beside me. Someone who gave up things of her own so I could keep moving forward. Meredith tightened her grip on the edge of the silver tray. The metal bit into her palm. For those 7 seconds, something very old and very foolish surged up inside her chest. A thought she was ashamed of the moment it appeared. She thought he was about to say her name. She thought that after 2 years, in front of an auditorium filled with 400 people, he was finally going to give her name back to her. She stood there behind the curtain in kitchen clothes, sugar still clinging to her hands, and waited. That person, Preston said, is sitting in the front row tonight. The camera image appeared on the large screen. Camille Ashcroft. The room erupted in applause. Meredith let the curtain fall. But before she could release it completely, she heard the entire ballroom gasp, and she pulled it open again. Preston had stepped down from the stage, walked to the front row, and lowered himself onto one knee before a woman in an ivory evening gown. In his hand was a small velvet box. Camille, for the past 2 years, you've been the reason behind everything I do, he said into the handheld microphone. Will you marry me? Camille Ashcroft lifted both hands to cover her mouth, nodded, then began to cry. The entire ballroom rose to its feet. In the third row, a silver-haired man applauded slowly, his face carrying the satisfied expression of someone watching an investment finally pay off, and the person beside him leaned over and said something that made him smile. It was Warren Ashcroft, superintendent of the Boston School District, the man who had signed a decision in a single day 2 years earlier. Meredith stood behind the curtain without moving. She didn't cry. She only felt her hands turn cold very quickly, and when she looked down, she saw that the edge of the silver tray had cut a red line into her palm. She set the tray on the stainless steel table, turned on the faucet, washed her hand, then dried it with a paper towel. The kitchen supervisor passed by and told her to get the final batch of cookies out to the dessert table before the reception portion began. Yes, she said. In the corner of the ballroom, about 50 feet from the dessert table, an older security guard in a gray uniform stood against the wall beside the circuit breaker box, his eyes fixed on the velvet curtain where Meredith had just been standing. He had been there since 7 o'clock that evening, and for the entire 40 minutes that had just passed, he was the only person among all 400 people in that ballroom who hadn't turned his face toward the stage. Meredith carried the final tray of cookies out to the dessert table just as the reception began, and she needed only 40 more seconds to finish. She arranged the cookies in 3 rows, turned the platter until it sat straight, and was about to walk away when she heard someone call her name through the microphone. Meredith? The entire ballroom turned. Preston stood about 30 feet away, the trophy still in his hand, and his face wore an expression of surprise that was just a little too exaggerated. My God, it really is you. He walked toward her, and the crowd instinctively opened into a clear space across the floor. Everyone, this is Meredith Calloway. Some of the teachers here may still remember her. He spoke into the microphone, his voice still warm, still slow. She used to teach at Wexford Prep. Now she bakes cookies. Every profession deserves respect. Somewhere in the room, someone gave a quiet laugh. Meredith said, I'm finished here. I'm leaving. She had taken 2 steps when Preston spoke again, louder this time. Wait, for the past 2 years, you've been going around telling people I stole your work. I've heard all of it. Since everyone's here tonight, why don't we settle this once and for all? He turned toward the technical booth and raised one hand in a signal. The large screen behind the stage, the same screen that moments earlier had shown Camille Ashcroft crying with happiness, changed to a document. Disciplinary ruling, Boston School District, signed 2 years earlier. Misappropriation of a colleague's work. Fabrication of supporting documents. The second page appeared. Revocation of teaching license, effective indefinitely. Then came the third page, and this time the entire ballroom fell completely silent, not because of shock, but because something deeply uncomfortable seemed to crawl up the backs of their necks. It was a bill from the Brookline nursing home, bearing the name Adeline Calloway, with a red line showing the unpaid balance. "I'm not trying to humiliate you," Preston said. "I only want everyone to understand why some people feel the need to tear others down. When you're desperate enough for money, you can convince yourself of all kinds of things." Meredith didn't look at the screen. She looked directly at him and asked in a perfectly ordinary voice. So ordinary that people standing nearby would later say it was that voice more than anything else that made it hard to breathe. "Where did you get that bill?" Preston hesitated for half a second. At that exact moment, Camille Ashcroft stepped forward. She didn't say anything. She simply reached out and struck the edge of the silver tray on the dessert table, sending 300 cookies crashing onto the marble floor, rolling everywhere, breaking beneath the feet of the crowd. "Clean it up," Camille said. "That's your job, isn't it?" Meredith stood still for 3 seconds. Then she knelt down and began picking them up, one by one. She picked up the broken ones too, gathering the crumbs into her palm and placing them on the tray. No one helped her. 400 people stood watching a 27-year-old woman crawl across the floor picking up cookies. And among those 400 were at least 11 people who had once shared a faculty room with her. There was the sound of phones taking pictures. Someone laughed, then quickly covered their mouth. Meredith didn't argue. She had picked up somewhere past the 20th cookie when a pair of shoes stopped in front of her, and a woman's voice came from above, trembling but clear. "I saw you copy the data drive." Josie Marlowe stood there, still holding a glass of wine, her face drained white. "That February, 3rd floor computer room. I went in to get some materials, and I saw you plug Meredith's drive into the computer, open the Lightbox folder, and copy it. I wrote down the time. I still have it." Preston opened his mouth, but he wasn't the one who answered. Warren Ashcroft stepped forward from the front row, his glass still in his hand, and spoke with a calmness that was almost gentle. "Miss Marlowe, isn't it? You teach English." He nodded thoughtfully. "Your husband's name is Danny, if I remember correctly. Waiting for a kidney transplant at Bayside Medical Center, isn't he? Their waiting list is terribly long. Fortunately, our school district foundation has been funding their patient assistance program for 6 years now. I'm on the coordinating board." He took a sip of wine. "Please, go on. I'm listening." The ballroom went utterly still. The wine glass in Josie's hand began to tremble, shaking hard enough for the wine to spill across the back of her hand. She looked down at Meredith, who was still kneeling on the floor. Meredith looked up and shook her head, very slightly, just enough for Josie to see. "Josie, stop. Go home." Josie straightened. She set the wine glass down on the table and said, her voice still trembling but not any quieter, "That February, 3rd floor computer room, 3:40 in the afternoon. I saw him copy it." Warren Ashcroft raised one eyebrow. And at that exact moment, in the corner of the ballroom, the large screen went black. The entire room plunged into darkness for 2 seconds, and the startled sound of 400 people rose like a wave. In the corner of the ballroom, beside the circuit breaker box recessed into the wall, an old hand withdrew from behind the metal door and dropped to the man's side. 10 seconds later, a younger security guard came running over, opened the panel, flipped the switch back into place, and the large screen lit up again on the very same nursing home bill it had been displaying before. But those 10 seconds had been enough, because when the lights came back on, a man in a gray security uniform was standing in the middle of the floor, about 3 steps from where Meredith was still kneeling. "Turn that screen off," he said. No one turned it off. Preston looked at him, then glanced around for the hotel manager. "Who let you in here?" "I'm working this shift," the man replied. "Since 7 o'clock tonight." He turned toward the crowd, and because he had no microphone, he had to speak louder than usual, his voice rough like that of someone who hadn't spoken much in a very long time. "I worked security in the Wexford Prep Laboratory building for 4 years. Night shift, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. For those 4 years, I locked that building every night, and I knew who was always the last person to leave the 2nd floor laboratory." He pointed toward the floor, toward Meredith. "Her. 311 nights in a school year. I wrote it down. The security logs have arrival and departure times, signatures, dates, and for 3 years no one has bothered to open them and look." He turned toward Preston. "And you left the school at 4 o'clock every afternoon. 4 years, not one day missed." A murmur spread through the room. Preston laughed. "This old security guard must be remembering things wrong." "I'm not remembering wrong," the man said, "and I've already spoken about this once." He slipped a hand into the breast pocket of his uniform, but didn't take anything out. "1 year ago, I sent an envelope to the school's disciplinary board. Inside were copies of 3 pages from the security log, photographs of the laboratory whiteboard with dates written on it, and the names of 2 other security officers who were willing to testify. I put it in the internal mailbox on September 17th. I asked for a receipt. He paused. No one called me in. No one asked me a single question. 3 weeks later, 2 more cameras were installed in the laboratory hallway, pointed directly at the internal mailbox. The ballroom went silent. Meredith looked up at him, her palm still full of cookie crumbs, and there was confusion in her eyes, the look of someone hearing something she had never known before. Warren Ashcroft stepped forward. He smiled, the smile of a man about to bring an inconvenience to an end. What was your name again? People call me Walter. Walter. All right, Walter. Warren set down his glass. Do you understand that you're standing in the middle of an awards ceremony for one of the finest private schools in the state? Do you understand who you're interrupting? Yes. Then who are you to stand here and say these things? The security guard lowered his head slightly and answered with perfect calm, without the slightest sign of humiliation. No one, he said. Just the man who cleans up. Then he lifted his face. The chandelier light fell directly across it, revealing every wrinkle, the broken bridge of his nose, and his pale gray eyes. And at that exact moment, at the far end of the ballroom, the main doors opened. The hotel manager was walking backward in front of someone, bowing slightly, one hand gesturing the way forward as he said something about how honored they were to have her there. Behind him, a silver-haired woman in a simple dark suit stepped into the room, holding a glass of wine that someone had just handed her at the door. She was 2 hours late because of a meeting in Worcester, and she had come only because her company's name was printed on the final line of the invitation, and she had intended to stay exactly 15 minutes out of courtesy. Cordelia Whitmore crossed the threshold, lifted her eyes toward the ballroom, and the wine glass slipped from her hand. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and clean in the completely silent room. 400 people turned to look at her. The hotel manager hurriedly called for someone to clean it up. Bethany stepped forward from behind her and took her employer by the elbow, asking whether she was all right. Cordelia didn't answer. She didn't look at the broken glass at her feet. She didn't look at Meredith kneeling in the middle of the floor, 40 steps away and hidden behind the crowd. She was staring directly at the man in the gray security uniform standing in the center of the ballroom, and not one of the 400 people there that night understood why. The sound of the wine glass shattering at the far end of the ballroom pulled the attention of 400 people away for about 5 seconds. And in those 5 seconds, Camille Ashcroft decided that her evening had already been ruined enough. She turned, picked up a glass of red wine from the dessert table, and took 2 steps toward Meredith, who was still kneeling on the floor. "You've ruined this entire night," she said, and she raised her arm. The wine never came down. A hand caught her wrist in midair and held it exactly where it was, not squeezing, not jerking, simply holding it, and Camille's entire arm stopped as though it had been nailed to the air. The wine sloshed over the rim and spilled onto the marble floor, spreading into a dark stain beside the broken pieces of cookie. No one knew where the man had come from. No one had seen him enter the ballroom, and no one could remember how long he had been standing there. He wore a dark coat, had no guest badge, and spoke in an ordinary voice, no louder than someone talking in a coffee shop. "As long as I'm standing here, no one touches her." He let go. Camille stepped back, clutching her wrist even though it didn't hurt, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had just touched something. Her instincts were warning her to stay away from, even before her mind had caught up enough to understand why. Meredith looked up. She recognized him immediately. The customer who had left $300 for a $15 bag of cookies. The man who had asked her that strange question about the Whitmore family, and then walked away. She stood, still holding the tray of broken cookies in both hands, and spoke very softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You should go." Cassian looked down at her. "You don't understand," she said quickly. "That man over there is the superintendent of the Boston School District. The man who just proposed is the vice principal. That woman's family holds seats on the boards of 4 universities. They can't take anything else from me anymore. I've already lost everything. But you still have a job. You still have a family. Don't bring trouble on yourself because of me." Cassian was silent for exactly 1 beat. In his 33 years, he had heard many people speak to him about consequences. No one had ever warned him about the consequences he himself might suffer. And certainly no one had ever done it while kneeling on the floor picking up broken cookies. "Just stay right there," he said. The hotel manager had already run off to get someone. Less than a minute later, Principal Gerald Voss was pulled away from table number 3 with his napkin still in his hand, and Warren Ashcroft pointed toward Cassian. "Voss, handle this." Some man without an invitation came in here and started causing trouble. Please escort him out." Voss approached with the irritated expression of a man being disturbed in the middle of dinner. He took 4 steps, then slowed down. 2 steps later, he stopped completely. He stared at the face of the man standing before him, stared very carefully, and everyone nearby saw the blood drain from his face within seconds. Voss didn't say a word. He didn't apologize either. He simply stepped back half a pace, folded the napkin in his hand neatly in half, turned around, and walked straight toward the side door. Halfway there, he looked back once, then began walking faster. "Voss?" Warren called after him. "Voss." No one answered. The entire ballroom watched the principal disappear through the side door, and a different kind of silence began spreading through the room. The silence of people who had just realized there was something happening in front of them that they didn't understand. Preston looked around and gave an awkward laugh. He probably had something to take care of. Warren Ashcroft didn't laugh. He set his glass on the table, adjusted his collar, and walked up to Cassian. He was a man of the system and had been for 30 years, and in all those 30 years he had never encountered a door that didn't open when he knocked. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but this is an event of the Boston School District, hosted by Wexford Prep, and I am the superintendent of this district. That woman is a contracted worker. She has completed her assignment and is now being asked to clean up. None of this has anything to do with you." He looked directly at Cassian. "Who are you to interfere in the affairs of my district?" Cassian didn't answer immediately. He bent down, picked up an unbroken cookie lying near his shoe, brushed it clean, and placed it on the tray Meredith was holding. Only then did he look up. "I asked who you are," Warren Ashcroft repeated, and this time he spoke louder, loud enough for all 400 people to hear, because he understood that in rooms like this, the person who lost control of the moment was the person who lost. "Fine. If you don't want to answer, that's all right. Let me introduce myself first." He turned halfway toward the crowd. "The Ashcroft Education Foundation, $40 million, operating for 19 years, providing scholarships to more than 2,000 students across this state. I hold seats on the boards of 4 universities. My daughter has just become engaged to the vice principal of the school we're honoring tonight." He turned back to Cassian. "And you are standing here without an invitation, and no one even knows your name. So I'm going to ask you one last time, and I'm asking very politely, who are you?" Cassian didn't boast about anything. He didn't take out a business card, didn't mention a single number, and didn't speak his family's name. He simply asked a question in return. "Do you know the name of the chairman of the Wexford Prep Board?" Warren frowned. "Of course. Bertram Kessler. 3 years ago, Mr. Kessler bought a chain of 4 warehouses in South Boston. He didn't borrow from a bank because his credit record wasn't clean at the time. He borrowed privately. Do you know who he borrowed from?" Warren didn't answer. "The first name," Cassian said. "Go home and ask Mr. Kessler. He'll tell you." Warren gave a contemptuous laugh. "I don't have time to listen to other people's business dealings." "Then let's talk about yours," Cassian said. "Your house in Brookline, purchased in 2017, still has roughly 2/3 of the mortgage outstanding. That mortgage is held by a small private bank on Devonshire Street. The bank has only 2 branches, doesn't advertise, and doesn't accept walk-in customers. Have you ever wondered why they approved you so quickly?" Warren opened his mouth, then closed it again. "The second name," Cassian said. "Every piece of laboratory equipment, every desk, every chair, every projector used by 41 schools in the Boston district is transported by a single freight company that has won the contract 7 years in a row. That company keeps its vehicle yard in Chelsea. You approve that contract once every year. And I believe you've never read the final section, the one listing the parent company." Cassian paused. "The third name." The ballroom was so quiet that the air conditioning could be heard. Someone at table number 5 stood up and moved quietly toward the door. Then someone else followed. Camille grabbed her father's sleeve. "Dad, what is he talking about?" Warren pulled his arm away from his daughter. The color in his face had already begun to change. He was still trying to keep his voice steady, but it had thinned noticeably. "Are you telling me these things to intimidate me? I can call the police right now." "Go ahead," Cassian said. "But before you call, listen to the fourth name." He stepped forward half a pace. "The Ashcroft Education Foundation receives funding from 11 businesses. Of the $40 million you just mentioned, more than half came from 3 names. One of those 3 is a company registered in Delaware. You've never met anyone from that company. The money arrives in the account regularly every quarter, and the name of its legal representative is—" He spoke a name. It was the only name he said aloud during the entire evening. Warren Ashcroft couldn't speak anymore. He stood there with one hand still half raised, and the wineglass he had just set on the table began to tremble faintly because his hand was touching the table leg. The man who, in 30 years, had never knocked on a door that failed to open, had just heard 4 doors close in succession. And he understood something the crowd in the room didn't yet understand. Those 4 names weren't 4 threats. They were 4 strings, and every one of them was held in a single man's hand. Preston stepped forward, leaned toward his future father-in-law, and quietly asked what was happening. Warren didn't answer. He looked at Cassian, and for the first time that evening, he lowered his voice. "What do you want?" Cassian turned and looked at Meredith, who was still standing there, holding the tray of broken cookies, then turned back. "I want you to turn off that screen," he said. "It's been 3 minutes, and no one has done it yet." Someone at the technical table finally turned off the screen. One portion of the room dimmed, and in that silence, Camille Ashcroft found what she needed. She had been standing there long enough to notice it. When Cassian bent down earlier to pick up the cookie, the collar of his shirt had fallen slightly open, and a silver chain had slipped out, with a small tarnished ring hanging from it. She laughed, and she laughed loudly, deliberately loudly. "Oh my God," she pointed at his chest. "Everyone, look at this. He stands here talking about banks and contracts, and look what he's wearing around his neck." Several people turned. "A tin ring," Camille said. "The kind you put 50 cents into a machine for. The kind children wear for fun and then throw away. You're supposed to be so rich, and you're wearing plastic jewelry?" Preston laughed with her, visibly relieved to have finally found something to hold on to. "Exactly. I thought that was strange too. People with real money don't wear things like that." Cassian raised a hand, pulled the chain fully out from beneath his collar, and let it rest openly against his chest. He didn't hide it. 15 years ago, he said. July. There was a garden party in Beacon Hill. The family hosting it had invited a great many people, but I wasn't one of them. I was 18. I went there looking for someone, and I sat at the edge of the garden for 2 hours without a single person speaking to me. The ballroom slowly grew quiet. Even the people who had been laughing stopped. A child came running out to where I was sitting. She was about 12 years old, carrying a plate of cookies in both hands, and she told me there were too many people inside and too much food, and asked me to help her eat some. I ate 2 lavender honey cookies, with 3 strokes of sea salt across the top. He looked down at the ring. Then she ran away. A little while later, she came back holding this. There was a red vending machine outside the gate, the kind with a metal handle you turn. She put money into it, turned the handle, and got this tin ring. She pushed it into my hand and said, "For you, so you can still find your way home." Cassian lifted his eyes and looked at Camille. "You asked why I wear it. Because that night, my father was taken into surgery after 4 hospitals had already refused him. The man who made sure my father got that surgery was the owner of that house, someone I had never met, someone who didn't ask what my father did for a living and only asked how much time he had left. My father lived another 6 years. In those 6 years, he had enough time to teach me everything I know." He held the ring between 2 fingers. "This is worth 50 cents, but if you weighed it against everything in this room, including your father's $40 million, you would still lose." 3 steps away, Meredith stood completely still. The tray of broken cookies in her hands began to tremble, shaking hard enough that several crumbs slid onto the floor. Something had just flashed inside her mind. Not a memory, not enough to be called a memory, only a disconnected fragment with no beginning and no end. The smell of freshly cut grass, fierce sunlight on the back of her neck, and a red vending machine with a metal handle whose paint had chipped away. She didn't know where she was seeing it. She only knew that her hands had suddenly gone ice cold. "You," she began. She didn't get to finish. Camille Ashcroft stepped forward and yanked the chain hard from Cassian's neck. The silver chain snapped, and the ring flew loose, struck the marble floor, and rolled half a turn. 50 cents is still 50 cents, she said, and she placed the heel of her shoe on it, pressed down, and twisted half a turn. The sound of thin metal flattening beneath her heel was very small, but all 400 people heard it. No one said anything. There wasn't a single laugh. Camille lifted her foot, and in that very second, even she realized she had just done something wrong, though she didn't yet understand how wrong it was. Cassian looked down at the floor. Then he lowered himself onto one knee among the broken cookies and the dried stain of spilled wine, and picked up every piece of the crushed tin ring, carefully, leaving nothing behind, gathering the pieces into his palm. Meredith set down the tray, knelt beside him, and picked up one small fragment that had rolled farther than the others. She held it out to him. Her hand was still trembling. Cassian took it, looked at her for a moment, then stood. He took out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke 3 sentences. his voice as ordinary as it had been when he spoke to Warren Ashcroft. "Bruno, get me the file on the batch of heart valves from 2009. He paused. "And call all of them in. Noon tomorrow." He ended the call. Warren Ashcroft asked, his voice hoarse. "Call who in?" Cassian slipped the phone back into his pocket. "You'll find out." At the far end of the ballroom, Cordelia Whitmore was still standing in exactly the same place. She hadn't heard a single word of anything that had just happened. She was still staring at the old security guard. Bethany had to call her employer 3 times before Cordelia finally heard her. "Ma'am, they've finished cleaning up. Would you like to leave?" Cordelia didn't answer. She walked into the ballroom, and the crowd parted for her on its own. Because everyone had just heard the hotel manager announce her name at the entrance, she went straight toward the place where the elderly security guard had been standing moments earlier. But the spot was empty. While everyone had turned toward the sound of the shattered wineglass, he had stepped back behind a column, and now he was standing in the kitchen corridor, hidden behind a half-open door, both hands clenched tightly together. Cordelia stopped in the middle of the floor. She looked around, searching, and her eyes fell on the young woman standing beside the scattered pieces of broken cookies. 400 people held their breath. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew the silver-haired woman was the principal sponsor of the evening, and they had just watched her drop a glass of wine the moment she looked into this room. Bethany stepped forward and handed her the leather case. "Ma'am, the documents Mr. Penhall sent this afternoon. You asked me to bring them." Cordelia opened the case right there in the middle of the ballroom. She had already read it once in the car, during the 20-minute drive back from Worcester, and she had folded it shut before finishing the final page. Now she opened it again. Meredith Calloway, 27 years old. No original birth record. Current identity documents reissued at age 12 through an adoption proceeding with the Department of Family Services. Adoptive parent, Adeline Calloway. Former public school cafeteria worker. Currently receiving long-term care at a nursing facility with accumulated fees of $4,200 per month and payments overdue. 2 years earlier, teaching license revoked by the Massachusetts State Teacher Certification Board. Reason: misappropriation of a colleague's work and fabrication of supporting documents. Copy of ruling attached. Began selling pastries at the North End Farmers Market 3 months ago. Sales location lies directly along Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore's established morning walking route. Assessment: subject has a documented history of fraud, is under severe financial distress, and may have deliberately selected the location in order to establish contact. Cordelia reached that final line, and something inside her slammed shut. She had read 7 lines almost identical to those 6 times over the past 15 years. The woman from Lowell had been desperate for money too. The one who knew Barnaby's name had once been fired for dishonesty. The woman in Providence had disappeared before Cordelia could reach her. Every time, Cordelia had told herself this one was different, and every time, she had gone home unable to eat for 4 days. She looked up at Meredith. She looked at her for a very long time. She studied that face, that bridge of the nose, the way the young woman stood, with her weight tilted slightly to the left, and she felt her heart begin to pound so hard that it made her angry, because that was exactly what the other 6 had done to her. "You," she said. Meredith looked up. "Yes, ma'am? You sell pastries at the North End Market." "Yes," Meredith said, and then she recognized her. "I met you Monday morning. You bought 2. Cordelia folded the report closed. When she spoke, her voice sounded as dry as paper. "You're the 7th. Don't waste my time." Then she turned her back and walked straight toward the door. Meredith stood there. She didn't understand. She truly didn't understand a single word. She watched the silver-haired woman move through the crowd, and she opened her mouth to ask what she meant. But Cordelia had already reached the door. The 7th what? Waste what time? A complete stranger had just accused her of something, when Meredith didn't even know what the accusation was, and of everything that happened that night. This was the sentence she would remember longest afterward. Camille Ashcroft burst out laughing. "Oh my God!" She clapped her hands. "Even the sponsor knows what kind of person you are. Were you trying to scam her too?" Laughter started in a few places, then spread wider through the room. Meredith lowered her head, picked up the remaining tray of broken cookies, and walked toward the kitchen corridor. At the ballroom entrance, Cordelia stopped for 1 second while someone opened the door for her. The report was still in her hand. She didn't look at it again, so she didn't see what was written in the lower right corner of the cover page, in the space reserved for the signature confirming that the contents had been reviewed before delivery. Arthur Penhall had followed her instructions exactly. Not one piece of paper had passed through the legal department at Whitmore Medical. But this report hadn't been prepared from the beginning by his office. It had been compiled from an original file transferred to him by a former associate, and that former associate had signed the lower corner to confirm it, exactly as procedure required. The handwritten name there belonged to someone who was sitting on the board of directors of Whitmore Medical. At 11 o'clock that night, only a few workers stacking chairs remained in the Chandler Hotel ballroom. Meredith stayed behind in the service kitchen to wash the last 10 silver trays, because the contract clearly stated that the supplier had to return all equipment clean, and because she didn't want to give anyone one more reason to deduct money from what she was owed. She stood at the sink with her hands submerged in hot water, working very slowly. She hadn't cried once that entire evening. She didn't cry when she heard her own project announced under someone else's name, didn't cry when she knelt on the floor picking up cookies in front of 400 people, and didn't cry when that silver-haired woman said the words Meredith still didn't understand. She only felt tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes when someone has been walking for too long and suddenly realizes they took the wrong road many miles ago. She heard footsteps behind her. Then a cup of coffee was placed on the stainless steel counter beside her. Meredith turned around. The elderly security guard stood there, still wearing his gray uniform, his hands empty. He had set down the cup and then stepped back half a pace, as though he were afraid of standing too close. She looked at the cup. Black coffee, no sugar, filled to about 4/5, with a paper napkin folded in half, resting loosely over the rim to keep it warm. Meredith stood completely still for a very long time. For 4 years, every morning when she reached the second-floor laboratory at 7 o'clock, there had always been a cup of black coffee waiting outside the door. No sugar, covered with a paper napkin folded in half exactly like this. She had asked everyone in security, asked the custodial staff, even asked the office secretary. No one ever admitted to leaving it. She used to joke with Josie that perhaps their school had a ghost, a kind one. Then she lost her job, and she forgot all about it until this moment. "It was you," she said. He didn't answer. Meredith lifted one hand to her mouth, and she began to cry. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders shaking, water streaming from her rubber gloves onto the kitchen floor. She had remained standing for 4 straight hours in a room full of people who wanted to see her collapse, and the thing that finally brought her down was a cup of coffee. "Why were you so kind to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You didn't even know who I was. I never did anything for you. 4 years. Every single morning. And tonight you stood in the middle of that ballroom and spoke up for me. You're over 60 years old. If you do things like that, they'll fire you, not me." The old security guard looked at her, and it took him a long time before he could speak. "Because there are people who owe you more than you realize." Meredith wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat. "Who?" He didn't answer that question. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform, took out a key tied to a cord, and an old piece of paper folded into quarters, its edges worn as though it had been carried in that pocket for a very long time. He placed both on the stainless steel counter and pushed them toward her. "Take these." "What are they?" "A small storage unit in Chelsea. No one lives there. There are a few boxes of my papers inside," he said. "Tomorrow, if something happens that you don't understand, don't stand there waiting for someone to explain it to you. Just go there, open it, and look through everything." Meredith picked up the folded paper. "What's going to happen?" "I'm not sure either," he said. "But too many people were touched at the same time tonight." "Sir," she called after him when he had already turned away. "At least tell me your real name. People call you Walter. But when the superintendent asked who you were earlier, you said you were just the man who cleans up. I saw you hesitate." He stopped in the middle of the passageway. He didn't turn around. "My name doesn't matter, Miss Calloway. It matters to me." He stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he lifted a hand to adjust his collar, and the motion caused the left sleeve of his uniform to slide back slightly. The kitchen light directly above him shone onto his wrist. On the wrinkled skin just below his left wrist joint was a pale brown birthmark, with 2 edges spreading outward and a pointed shape in the center, exactly like a bird with its wings open. Meredith didn't see it. She was bending down to pick up the key that had just slipped from her hand. By the time she looked up, the corridor was empty. The kitchen door was slowly swinging shut, and the coffee on the stainless steel counter was still steaming. At 11:58 on Sunday morning, the lobby of the Chandler Hotel still bore the marks of the night before, with several backdrops not yet taken down and rows of chairs still waiting to be stacked. Warren Ashcroft had been there since 11 o'clock, because he hadn't slept the night before, and because that morning he had made 11 phone calls, and only 3 had been answered. Preston and Camille stood beside him, neither of them understanding why they had been told to come. At exactly 11:58, the first car stopped outside the entrance. Bertram Kessler, chairman of the Wexford Prep Board of Trustees, stepped inside, looked at no one, walked directly to where Cassian was sitting alone on a chair in the middle of the lobby, bowed his head in greeting, then stepped back and stood to one side. The second arrival was the director of the private bank on Devonshire Street. The third was a city councilman. The fourth was the chief executive of the freight company in Chelsea. One by one they entered, one by one they bowed their heads, and not one of them said a word. Warren Ashcroft stood there watching the 4 names he had dismissed as inventions the night before pass directly in front of him. Camille tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, who are these people?" "Be quiet." 1 minute before noon, the final car pulled up. The man who stepped out was a tall, elderly gentleman, with white hair combed straight back, wearing a wool overcoat. And the moment Warren Ashcroft saw him, he let out a breath of relief so obvious that Preston heard it. It was Garrett Loomis, owner of the Loomis Barrow Medical Equipment Corporation, the man people in Boston had jokingly called the city's true master for the past 20 years. He was Warren's principal benefactor, and the man who had lifted Warren from the position of corporate attorney into the superintendent's chair. "Mr. Loomis," Warren stepped forward, half of his confidence already returning to his voice. "You've come at exactly the right time. There was a man last night who—" Garrett Loomis wasn't listening. He had seen the man sitting in the chair at the center of the lobby. He stopped dead. The cane in his hand fell to the stone floor and rolled several times. Then that 71-year-old man dropped to both knees in the middle of the hotel lobby in front of more than 24 people. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear I didn't know it was you." Warren Ashcroft stood rooted to the spot. Camille released her father's sleeve. Preston took 1 step backward and bumped into a row of chairs. Cassian rose to his feet. He didn't look at Loomis. He opened a file on the table beside the chair, then called to Meredith, who had entered the lobby 10 minutes earlier after Bruno had gone all the way to the North End Market to bring her there. "Come here." She walked over. Cassian pushed the file toward Preston. "April, 2 years ago. A company registered in Delaware transferred $90,000 into your account in 3 separate payments. That company has no employees and no office. It has only 1 legal representative." He looked at Warren. "That representative is a former associate of yours, and you were the one who signed the power of attorney. That money didn't come from the school, didn't come from the Education Foundation, and didn't come from any award." The lobby fell silent. $90,000 for you to put your name on a high school curriculum," Cassian said to Preston, "and for her to lose her standing as a researcher." Meredith turned and looked at Preston. She didn't shout. She asked in a perfectly ordinary voice, and it was that ordinary tone that he couldn't bear. "We were together for 2 years, she said. "Was any of it ever real?" Preston opened his mouth. No sound came out. "Answer me," she said. "I'm not asking so I can blame you. I just want to know what those 2 years of my life really were." He lowered his face. He couldn't answer, and that silence was clearer than anything he could have said. Meredith gave 1 small nod, very faintly, like someone who had just received confirmation of something she'd suspected for a long time. Then she turned toward Warren Ashcroft. "And you," she said, "you paid $90,000. You signed that ruling in 1 day without calling me in to ask a single question. You took away my license and barred me from teaching anywhere in the entire state." Her voice began to tremble, but she kept going. "Why me? I wasn't anyone's rival. I wasn't competing for anyone's position. I wasn't suing anyone. I didn't even know who you were. I was just a science teacher at a high school." She looked directly at him. "What did I do that was worth spending that much money just to crush me?" Warren Ashcroft didn't answer. Meredith turned back to Preston. "You know, don't you? You took the money. You must know." Preston looked up. His face was white. He stammered. "I don't know. I swear. I took the envelope. He told me the matter ended there, and I thought it was only about the curriculum dispute. I didn't ask. For 2 years, I never asked." Meredith's question remained hanging in the lobby, and not one of the more than 24 people present could answer it, except one. At the entrance, the glass door had just been pushed open. The man who walked in was an elderly security guard wearing a gray uniform faded at the elbows, carrying a canvas bag in one hand. Meredith turned and recognized him immediately. "Sir." He didn't look at her. He walked straight into the middle of the lobby and set the canvas bag down on the stone floor. Garrett Loomis was still kneeling where he had been moments earlier. He looked up at the newcomer, and within 3 seconds, his entire face turned gray. He pushed himself to his feet, stumbled back 2 steps, and struck a row of chairs. "No," he said. "That can't be. You're dead." "I'm not dead," the security guard said. Then he turned toward Meredith and looked at her for a very long time before speaking the next sentence. The sentence he had kept locked behind his teeth for 3 years. "I'm Hollis Whitmore." Not a sound moved through the lobby. Meredith stood perfectly still. She had heard that name for the first time only a few days earlier, from the mouth of a customer buying cookies, and she had thought Whitmore was simply the name of a company that made breathing machines. Hollis opened the canvas bag, took out a thick, hardbound file, and placed it on the table beside where Cassian had been sitting. 15 years ago, I was the technical director of Whitmore Medical. In May of that year, my inspection division discovered that a batch of heart valves manufactured in 2009 had a defect in the sealing ring. The valves didn't fail immediately. They failed after 5 to 7 years of use. He placed one hand on the file. We didn't manufacture that batch. We purchased the components from a factory in Springfield owned by Loomis Barrow. More than 4,000 of those valves had already been implanted in patients across 8 states. Garrett Loomis kept shaking his head. You don't have proof. I do, Hollis said. I've had it for 15 years. I had an appointment with the Food and Drug Administration on July 19th. I never made it there. He turned toward Warren Ashcroft. Because 3 days earlier, a young corporate attorney submitted a file to my company's board of directors claiming that I was the one who had altered the inspection data, that I had concealed the technical defect for 2 years, and was preparing to blame the supplier to save myself. The file was done very carefully. It had my signature. It had timestamps. It even had emails I had never written. Warren Ashcroft didn't move. They gave me 2 choices, Hollis continued. One was to go to court. My wife had just become chairwoman at the time, and my daughter was 12. If I went to court, they said they would also release documents claiming that my wife knew about the defect and ignored it, and Whitmore Medical would lose its license within a year. Then no one would be left to monitor those 4,000 patients. The second choice was for me to disappear. He paused. I chose the second. On July 22nd, I drove out to the bay, left the car and my coat on the pier, then walked north. Meredith raised a hand to her mouth. 15 years, Cassian said. What did you do for 15 years? Washed dishes in Portland for 3 years. Drove trucks for 4. Then worked security, Hollis said. I couldn't risk looking for my wife. The moment I appeared, that file would have been submitted within 24 hours. And I couldn't find my daughter. She became seriously ill that summer, and by the time I traced what had happened, the hospital records carried a different name and a different address. I was told she'd been adopted. He turned and looked at Meredith. 3 years ago, I read a small article in a local paper. It was about a science teacher at Wexford Prep who used her own money to buy components so her students could do experiments. In the photograph, she was sprinkling salt over a tray of cookies she had brought to class. His voice broke. 3 strokes. Meredith couldn't breathe. 4 months later, I applied for the night security job there, he said. I didn't dare say a single word to you, because if I did, you would take the Whitmore name, and they would know I wasn't dead. All I dared to do was leave a cup of coffee outside your door. That was all. Warren Ashcroft finally spoke, his voice dry. This has nothing to do with me. It does, Hollis said. 1 year ago, I sent an envelope to the school's disciplinary board asking them to clear my daughter's name. Inside were the security logs and the names of 3 witnesses. That envelope was never opened. 3 weeks later, cameras were installed facing the internal mailbox. I didn't dare send another one. He opened the file, turned to a marked page, and pushed it toward Meredith. It was a copy of her research grant application from 2 years earlier. The Scientific Foundation section. 3 data tables. Source citation. Public database. Recalled medical devices section. Batch of heart valves manufactured in 2009. You didn't know what you were citing, Hollis said. But he did. Meredith looked down at the page. Then she lifted her eyes toward Preston, who was standing 4 steps away, his face as white as the paper in front of her. $90,000, she said softly. It wasn't to steal my curriculum. It was to pull my application off the review table before anyone could read the final page. Preston opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked down at his own hands. For 2 years, he had lived with the belief that he had stolen a chance for advancement from his former girlfriend, and only now did he understand that what he had truly been paid to bury was 4,000 human lives. Cordelia Whitmore walked into the lobby of the Chandler Hotel at 12:20 in the afternoon, after Bethany had called her 3 times in a row and, on the 3rd call, managed to say only one sentence. Ma'am, your husband is alive. She came through the glass doors and saw her husband standing in the middle of the lobby wearing a faded gray security uniform. The 2 of them looked at each other. Neither moved forward. 15 years stood between them, and they were both too old now to run toward each other the way people did in movies. Hollis only said, I'm sorry. Cordelia stood there, still holding the leather case in one hand, and she didn't cry. She gave a single nod. Then she turned toward the young woman standing beside her husband, and her fingers tightened around the handle of the case. Bethany had told her everything on the way there. But inside that case was still the report Cordelia had read the afternoon before, and over 15 years she had learned one thing. What broke her wasn't the people who lied. It was herself, the part of her that always wanted to believe. "Mrs. Whitmore," Meredith said, "I don't understand what's happening. I really don't." Cordelia didn't answer. She turned toward the hotel manager, standing close to the wall in the corner, and said, "Let me use the kitchen." 15 minutes later, in the service kitchen, someone brought out a tray of dough that had already been mixed, rolled thin, and cut into round cookies, along with a jar of coarse sea salt. Cordelia placed both on the stainless steel table in front of Meredith. She didn't explain. She didn't ask a single question. She simply stepped back and watched. Meredith looked at the tray of dough, then at Cordelia, then around at the people standing farther back. She didn't understand what they wanted from her, but her hands had already begun moving on their own. She rolled up her sleeves, opened the jar of salt, and took a pinch between 3 fingertips. Then she raised her hand above the tray. 1, 2, 3. 3 quick, certain strokes, her wrist turning slightly at the end of each one, the grains of salt falling in 3 evenly spaced lines across the dough. When she finished, she set the jar down and looked up. Like this, Cordelia Whitmore couldn't remain standing. Her knees gave way, one hand catching the edge of the stainless steel table, and Bethany had to rush forward to support her. The woman who hadn't shed a single tear in front of anyone for 15 years, the woman who had signed decisions that cost 2,000 people their jobs without a tremor in her hand, sank onto the tiled kitchen floor and cried like a child. "Ma'am," Meredith dropped to her knees in alarm. "Are you all right? Did I do something wrong?" Cordelia caught her wrist. "Not 4, she said, her voice strangled with tears. 4 makes it too salty." Meredith went rigid. She pulled her hand away, opened her purse, and took out the cloth-bound notebook worn bare at all 4 corners. The notebook Adeline had pressed into her hands no fewer than 100 times. She opened it to the first page and placed it on the kitchen floor in front of Cordelia. A child's handwriting covered the paper, crooked and uneven, some letters large, some small, some written over one another because there had been no room left on the line. "Lavender honey cookies. Let the butter soften. Don't put it in the microwave. Use dark honey. 3 pinches of lavender, no more." And on the final line, written in blue-colored pencil, and traced over again and again until the paper had nearly torn, "Sprinkle sea salt in 3 strokes, not 4. 4 makes it too salty." Cordelia reached out and touched the page. She knew that handwriting. She had sat behind that child on a wooden stool in the Beacon Hill kitchen, held the little hand in hers and guided it through every letter, and it had been Cordelia herself who told her to write the final line in blue pencil, so she would remember it more easily. "You wrote this on your birthday," she said. "You were 12. You said you were afraid you might forget someday." Meredith lowered herself fully onto the kitchen floor, both hands shaking violently. "I really did forget." Cordelia took the report from her case, set it on the floor, and pushed it toward her. "Last night I had this in my hands. I read it twice," she said. "Then I looked at you, and my heart was beating too fast. I was afraid. I was so afraid that I had to say those words just so I could get away from there." She lowered her head. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I turned my back on you while you were kneeling on the floor." Meredith shook her head. "I'm not angry," she said, speaking very slowly because she was fighting to keep her voice from breaking. "People lied to you 6 times. 6 times you believed them, and 6 times you went home and couldn't eat for 4 days. I understand what that feels like. I believed someone for 2 years too." She looked down at the notebook. "They took away your ability to trust other people. That's the most expensive thing they took from you, not the 15 years. That afternoon, 3 people went to the Brookline nursing home. Nurse Marguerite was standing at the reception desk when she saw Meredith walk in with 2 strangers, and she was about to say something about that month's bill when Meredith handed her a receipt and said everything had already been paid, including the amount still owed from the previous month. Room 214 was at the end of the hallway. Adeline was sitting in her wheelchair beside the window, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Cordelia Whitmore stepped inside, stopped in the middle of the room, then walked forward and knelt in front of the wheelchair. She took those 2 aged hands in hers, hands that had cooked in public school cafeterias for 28 years, and she said, "Thank you. You raised my daughter for 15 years. You raised her on your own wages. I have $3 billion, and I couldn't do what you did." Adeline looked at the silver-haired woman kneeling in front of her with mild confusion. She didn't know who this woman was, but she saw someone crying, so she freed one hand and gently patted the back of Cordelia's hand, the way someone might comfort a child who had fallen down. "Don't cry," she said. "She's a good girl." Then she turned toward the window, where Meredith was standing. For one brief moment, her gaze suddenly sharpened, the curtain inside her mind drawn aside, and she called her by a name no one in the world had ever told her. "Rosie, come home, sweetheart." None of the 3 people in the room could say a word. The following week, people asked Meredith when she was moving into the house in Beacon Hill. She said she wasn't. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the ground floor near the North End Market, brought Adeline home, hired a nurse to care for her during the day, and paid for it with her own money. Cordelia didn't argue once. She only asked whether Meredith needed anything else, and Meredith said, "I just need you to come to Sunday dinner, Mom." 3 weeks later, Preston Hale came to the pastry stand at the North End Market at 5 o'clock in the morning. He waited until the customers had thinned out before stepping forward, then dropped to his knees right there on the sidewalk. He said he would sign everything necessary to return the entire curriculum to her, that he would testify to everything, that he would do anything she asked, and he begged her to let him start over. Meredith looked at him for a while. Then she took a cookie from the tray, wrapped it in paper, bent down, and placed it in his hand. "Stand up. The sidewalk is dirty," she said. Then she closed the lid of the pastry bin and turned to serve the next customer. 4 months later, Garrett Loomis and Warren Ashcroft were indicted on multiple charges related to falsifying medical device inspection records and concealing information that endangered patients. 4,200 patients were called back for re-examination, with the costs shared by Whitmore Medical and Loomis Barrow under court order. Preston Hale had his teaching license revoked indefinitely by the State Teacher Certification Board, the very thing he had once taken from someone else. Camille Ashcroft left Boston. Josie Marlowe was reinstated, received all the salary she had lost over 2 years, and the following autumn became the youngest principal in the history of Wexford Prep. 6 months after that, on a small corner in the North End, a new door opened. Upstairs was the Lightbox Learning Workshop, free for neighborhood children, a place where they were allowed to put their hands on the equipment first and search for the answers afterward. Downstairs was a bakery called Adeline's. On opening morning, the entire place was filled with laughter. Tiny hands dusted white with flour, and a boy of about 7 holding up his crooked little cookie for everyone to see as though it were a medal. Hollis Whitmore stood behind the counter, making coffee, black, no sugar, with a paper napkin folded in half, resting over the rim of the cup. Cordelia stood beside her daughter at the baking tray, and mother and daughter raised their hands together. 1, 2, 3. That afternoon, after the crowd had thinned out, Cassian Vitale came by. He placed a small box on the counter. Inside was the tin ring, restored by a jeweler on Newberry Street, though the dent along one side of the band had been left exactly as it was, just as Cassian had instructed. "Why didn't you ask them to smooth it out?" Meredith asked. "Because it really was dented," he said. She picked up the ring and turned it between her fingers. "What did you really come to Boston for?" "To prove you were an imposter," he said, "and to make Mrs. Whitmore sign a death certificate so I could settle a debt my family had carried for 15 years. Meredith laughed. "And now, that debt was paid a long time ago," he said. "It was paid the day a 12-year-old girl put 50 cents into a vending machine and told me, 'This is for you, so you can still find your way home.' I just didn't know it for 15 years. He looked at her. "So from today on, I'm not here because I owe anyone anything. Perhaps this story teaches us 3 things. Blood may give us a name, but the person who stays beside us and wipes our forehead when we're sick is the one who gives us a home. There are people who love us for years without ever daring to say our name, and that silence can also be a form of love, sometimes heavier than anything words could ever carry. And wealth can buy almost everything in this world except the 3 movements of a child's hand, as she stands beside her mother in a kitchen on a distant Sunday morning. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. What did you feel about this story? About the 2 mothers? About the father who remained silent for 15 years? Please leave a few lines in the comments, because we truly want to hear the deepest feelings from your heart. We wish you lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.